experiment was begun by a scientist who discovered, quite by accident, these signals being sent. Please understand, they are safe as long as they are not discovered.
A kill list was intercepted. It says everyone in this room will be dead. You're number 2 on the list. Well, who's number 1?
An unknown, a civilian.
Lookoutfa Charlie.
I want him down.
Going through history and finding cases of, mind experiments or experiments with voice of God weapons can be a daunting process. Let's remember that in 1952, that was when MK Ultra really began. Coincidentally, it was also the very first year that the DSM for psychiatry was released, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which doesn't even mention most of the things that begin to occur after that. One of the earliest strange cases I can find is a guy named Ronald Taman, and this happened in Ohio. So let's check it out and see what it said.
April 19th, 1953. Miami University sophomore Ron Taman was in his dorm room at Fisher Hall on campus, studying at night, and then he disappeared.
And was never seen again.
Ron's sister,
I can remember that.
So he was never seen again. This guy just got up and vanished. And from other stories that I've heard, they say that he found a fish in his bed, like a dead fish. Right away, because of all the traits of this case, I thought it was one of these cases, whether they were messing with his mind or messing with early versions of Voice of God weapons. And let's listen to what his sister has to say.
She says the news hit her family hard.
Because the constant question of what happened, where is he, why us?
And the story about his disappearance.
And he bumped his head and got amnesia.
They don't know that he bumped his head and got amnesia. This is one of the theories that they came up with. And believe me, when you watch these theories actually be made up in front of you, they're a lot harder to believe. But one person had some kind of common sense about the whole thing.
My mother believed that till the day she died.
Marcia said her father thought something different.
My father believed that the FBI was involved somehow, some way.
So his dad, for some reason, believed that the FBI was involved. Now, this isn't some lunatic living in a shack. Back when this type of thinking was tolerated, he actually thought this.
We began to get less and less communications with the FBI. And what communications were very vague.
As the case went cold, it started to heat up again, but this time with a new theory by a writer and a person who's been researching the case. Winger believes the case centers around the book left open on Ron Taman's desk the night he disappeared.
Psychology textbook was open on his desk when he disappeared. He had actually dropped the course by then.
Winger believes Taman's disappearance is connected to a professor who taught at Miami named St. Clair Switzer. She also believes he has ties to the CIA.
Before I knew that, I absolutely believed that this was some type of case. Now, I cannot prove that this was a Voice of God weapons case, but it has those hallmarks. The sudden freak out, the sudden runoff, trying to run away. That is what happens to a lot of people who experience these Voice of God weapons, is they try to run away. Or they tear their house up, thinking that it's in the wall somewhere. There's always a bewilderment and fear stage. And there's a handful of actions that go with that normally. Now, this is one of the very first cases of this kind of behavior that I could find. One of the very first. But I want to talk about Voice of God weapons. And one of the very first cases that I could actually say, okay, this is one of those cases. And that case happens to be the Brian Wilson case. Right around 1965, 1966 was when he began to suddenly hear voices. Out of nowhere, and right in the time frame that they were experimenting with these weapons heavily. This is one of the earliest cases I can find. And he's the perfect choice because he was experimenting with LSD and he was involved with drugs. So it is perfect that they target this guy. Perfect. And then the stories of LSD and the side effects, which, even scientists are refuting now, saying, I haven't seen any of these side effects. So you create these artificial side effects, and that causes false information about drugs and false information about psychiatry, psychology, subversion. But I'm not condoning that people do LSD here. I'm just saying that there are a lot of lies. When I was a kid, I saw movies, documentaries, where they would show people that thought that they were a piece of fruit or something, and it was absolute propaganda. And what did Brian Wilson hear? It says he heard voices saying derogatory things, telling him it was over and that soon he would die. So these are exactly the same things that other people are hearing. And for some reason, they want you to believe that somehow your brain turns on you and begins to attack you verbally. That almost sounds like you have a twin buried in your brain somewhere that doesn't like you. Your own brain turning on you and attacking you. The brain is just turning on people is wild and crazy. But what I want to talk about here are people who have dealt with these weapons and people in pop culture. The number of people that have been affected by these weapons, and it is so prevalent that people don't even realize it. And it gets blamed on a myriad of things, so there is brand confusion, and people can never put the pieces together. There's always these different reasons why it happened. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about how Hollywood and the music industry has a rich history of experimenting on certain people that get involved with them. Let me give you a partial list of people from pop culture history, from our history, that had these voice of God weapons used on them. A lot of them people don't know about. And then we'll get into the Hollywood aspect of this, the Hollywood and music industry aspect of this. So first, the very first one that I can find that is documented and contains the same hallmarks and actual voices, not sounds, warblings, or other things, but actual voices, is Brian Wilson. All right, so that was 65, 66-ish. And then we have John Linley Frazier, who was from Santa Cruz. So you had this hotbed of mind experiments happening in the Laurel Canyon area and LA and that area, and then you had Santa Cruz. And I'm sure when more and more investigation is done, we'll find that there were operational centers in those two areas. So you have John Linley Frazier in Santa Cruz who commits murder, and then right after that, in the exact same area, you had Herbert Mullen, who was a totally normal kid, and then started to hear God's voice telling him that he had to kill to stop a catastrophic earthquake. All right, so then after that, it spreads out to the East Coast. It begins to happen on the East Coast in the 70s. It was all on the West Coast, and then suddenly it's on the East Coast, and you have people like Butch DeFeo that heard his family whispering about him in the other room. Then you had David Berkowitz, son of Sam, who believed that he was actually being monitored by the FBI before all that started. Then, not long after that, you had Mark Chapman, who was John Lennon's killer, and he heard voices for a while that wanted him to go and take out John Lennon. Then, throughout the 80s, it began to happen to many random people in the populace. And then you have the guy who attacked Dan Rather and was punching him saying, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" That's what the REM song is named after. So he was punching him, going, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" And that continues, it continues. Then you have Patrick Purdy, who in 1989, he was the Cleveland elementary school shooter. Then you have Timothy McVeigh, and I cannot prove the McVeigh case, but he mentioned things like this all the time, that he was being tracked and that he believed he had something in his body that was tracking him. And then he told other people that he was going to be resuscitated after he was allegedly killed. Now, who would give him that information and tell him? Nobody. He probably heard this with Voice of God weapons contacting him as secret agents that couldn't contact him any other way, and contacted him this way and told him that to get him to believe it. Now, I can't prove this, but that is what I believe. Then you have Kip Kenkel, 1998 in Springfield, Oregon. He was a 15-year-old kid that killed his parents and then walked into a school, and he heard voices telling him to kill. Then you have Eileen Wuornos, who was the first quote-unquote female serial killer, right? And she heard voices telling her things and had sonic pressure on her head. She actually mentions all this in the Nick Broomfield documentary, and they just paint her out as crazy. And a lot of these people do sound crazy when they're explaining it, especially if they can't understand it and they have a hard time trying to process it, and they start blaming it on things that they don't fully understand. Then you have Nathan Gale, who is the guy that went and killed Dimebag Darrell. He had the exact same stuff going on. And then you have Cho, the Virginia Tech shooter. And then you have Myron May, the Florida State University shooter. He was a prosecutor who was driven mad well after the age of quote-unquote schizophrenia and all those other theories. And then you have Aaron Alexis, the Naval Yard shooter who carved my ELF weapon into his shotgun before actually doing it. Then you have James Holmes, the Batman Aurora shooter, who was hearing the voice of Obama, and Obama was quote-unquote communicating with him. Then you have Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who was the Boston Marathon bomber. Tamerlan was visited by the FBI multiple times, and then he began to hear 3 voices that were constantly putting him down and telling him things. So, can you say CIA Mossad op? After that, we have Jared Lee Loughner, who did one of these shootings. Then you have Nicholas Cruz, the Florida high school shooter, who heard quote-unquote demons. Then you have Jason Dalton, the Kalamazoo Uber shooter, who was just a regular dude trying to save money to take his family on vacation, and began to hear voices while he was driving for Uber. And then you have Stephen Paddock, the Vegas incident patsy, and right before he was suicided, he was telling people that he was a government mind control project. And this can go on and on and on. I can keep going and going and going, but I'm just picking out some key ones. People have no idea how prevalent this is in our society. None. But going back to Brian Wilson, as far as I can tell, he seems like one of the first cases of Voice of God weapons being used on somebody, and it happened to be somebody from the music industry or Hollywood. And then it begins to pick up and pick up and pick up. And then you have the Mickey Mouse Club and people that are involved in that. And all those kids end up dealing with crazy shit. Britney Spears, all of them have weird experiences, weird stuff going on. It's just bizarre, right? So let's talk about these Hollywood / music industry people a little bit. This kind of stuff used to happen to people in this industry once in a while. You would get one picked and they would go through all kinds of stuff. Now it is just commonplace for either Voice of God weapons to be used on these people, and or they get some type of quote-unquote psychosis. And the way they frame it is these people just snap. They just have a breakdown. So it's like, I'm eating my dinner. Let's say I'm having chicken Alfredo, and I'm chowing it down, and I'm watching some TV or whatever, and I put my fork down, and then right when I put my fork down, I decide the government's after me. You know, and that is really the way they frame it. It's like you just break down and suddenly you believe, for no reason, that the government is after you or you're hearing voices. It is absurd. You get involved with Hollywood or the music industry, and then shit will go down and take you out one way or another. Voice of God weapons have been used to make Britney Spears unstable or appear unstable so that she's not only controlled but has a diagnosis and has to be controlled by somebody else. You know, the whole conservatory thing. But it goes far deeper than that. You have Lane Staley, who is certainly having things happen to him. Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington suddenly just die of strange circumstances. Scott Weiland had Voice of God weapons being used on him. So did Scott Stapp was having weapons used on him. Mark Lanigan starts talking about 5G and they start calling him a conspiracy theorist, and he suddenly dies. You know, this goes on and on and on. But there is a long history of these people having these weapons used on them. Lane Staley was having all kinds of different weird experiences, enough to make Mark Lanigan even question his sanity. And then right before he died, this happened.
While watching Crossing Over, Lane turned to Mike and said, quote, "Demery was here last night. I don't give a fuck if you fucking believe me or not, dude. I'm telling you, Demery was here last night."
Now, what can we get out of that? We can certainly get that he was hearing something, and it probably wasn't who he thought it was. I can tell you that. So, right before this guy dies, these events are happening to him, and then suddenly he just dies. Now, Vince Neil went through the same thing with his daughter. What a horrible thing to do. So his daughter is talking to him, and he's hearing things, and things are going on. Let's check that out.
I want these energies out. You know, I'm tired of waking up in the middle of the night and hearing things, and it is about this entity that's like almost terrorizing me some nights.
So Vince Neil has been dealing with this for years, and he's got some phony psychic talking to him, going through this as if they're ghosts or whatever, and it's obvious what Vince Neil is dealing with. It's just amazing the people that have gone through this. And this is almost another perfect example of brand confusion, because a lot of these psychics out there who actually believe that they are psychic are just victims of this technology and actually believe that the voices or whatever they hear are coming from beyond, when that's not the case at all. You have to understand how prevalent this weapon is, and that the signal is everywhere. It can get to you anywhere. You are within the field. And if you are within the field, you can be gotten to. Scott Weiland was dealing with this. He was actually hearing them and thought they were aliens. Just like the dude from Cannibal Corpse. And that's why he wrote that song, Lovin' the Alien. It had everything to do with the alien voices he was hearing, which is exactly what the Cannibal Corpse dude dealt with. It's just amazing. One after the other, like dominoes, man. I am telling you. Scott Stapp from Creed. It says here, he had a breakdown in 2014 and thought the government was after him. And like I said, it's framed in such a weird way. It's like you just, you're doing something, put your fork down, and boom. I think the government's after me. You know, people do not just do that, man. It doesn't happen. Period. I don't care what people want you to think. It's ridiculous. So it says in 2014, Stapp posted a video online in which he said the government was after him. I really thought government agencies were tracking me and trying to do experiments on me. And people were tapped into my cell phone and computer. It was scary. So they get him to do a bunch of crap and discredit himself, and then convince him afterwards that it was just, you know, mental illness. And I believe he was hearing audio as well, but I'm not totally positive. And like I showed you a video or two ago, it's not always just words. One guy was actually just hearing the Navy fight song and didn't know it. So you've got this recording of the Navy fight song playing into your head. And how are they going to explain that? That your mind is also making up the music and the lyrics and everything? It doesn't make any sense. And let's go back to Mark Lanigan for a minute. Mark Lanigan's wife had all the flat screen TVs thrown out of their house because she knew that it was fucking with them. This happens to people. And that was probably right after Lanigan started talking about this, 5G and the rest of it. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this one, but I have dug deep into this for years, and I have my own theories about the Cobain case that a lot of people wouldn't get. And there's a lot of behaviors and a lot of things that happened with Cobain before his death that clue you into a much bigger picture than what people believe actually happened. And a lot of this information is very hard to find, but it says he was afraid. He thought he was being threatened by people following him. He thought he was being bugged. He was acutely paranoid. Well, we don't know that. And they always say this. They snapped, they're paranoid. Dude, bullshit. You get these people that are, relatively grounded and normal their whole lives, and then all of a sudden they're acutely paranoid. So it says here, when telephone engineers called the Lakeside Avenue house, Cobain locked himself in the basement, accusing the men of being agents sent to harass him. So there's a lot of shit going on with all these cases that is skewed, and you only hear pieces of it, and it paints a picture that it's just wrong. You have to put it all together. Now, I'm not saying that Kurt Cobain had voice of God weapons used on him, but something was going on. And I can prove that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Something was going on. I'll get into that later. Did that have to do with canceling tours and turning down headlining Lollapalooza? Could have. A lot of times when the plow horse won't plow anymore, they put it down. And that's what happened with a lot of these artists that get older and they're thought to be worth more dead than alive. Johnny Lewis from Sons of Anarchy rents a room in Hollywood and then begins to have weird stuff happen to him. He freaks out. He ends up attacking these workers that are on the neighbor's lawn doing something. Why would he do that? The only reason why he did it is because he believed they were doing something to him. And that is usually done with voice of God weapons. Like they'll say they've got their guy working on the house over there to do it to them, and drive them to do something completely insane. He ended up killing people, and then he ended up killing himself. So he jumped off the roof. It's just an insane story. And when you understand how these weapons work, it becomes quite obvious. Because you see things that never happened in the past. Like these people are walking down the street, right? And a security camera will catch somebody just lashing out and beating somebody for no reason. And then they take off. And I'm not talking about the New York clubbing people or hitting them for no reason, racially motivated stuff. I'm talking about just these bizarre, motiveless crimes that seem motiveless. And this is usually done with voice of God weapons. The person that did it is always hearing voices. And the voices are telling them that the people that are next to them are doing it. Somebody on the street, whatever. And what is this doing? This is testing the capability of Manchurians. So you can get somebody hearing voices and then tell them that their real target is doing it to them. And they go after and kill the target. This is intense stuff, and it's very real. And it's happening more and more and more. It's becoming the norm. But since the beginning of this Brian Wilson era, they really began to use it. The number of Hollywood and music industry test subjects is off the hook, and it's everywhere. But these guys don't just snap or have a breakdown, and the entire idea is just ridiculous. They are just isolated enough that they make perfect test subjects. You know, before these signals were active and in regular use, it was talked about everywhere. For example, in this paper right here by these doctors and scientists, it's all about chronic fatigue syndrome. And they have lots of evidence that prolonged exposure to ELF and electromagnetic fields is a cofactor to consider in chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, if you talked about that, they would take away your medical license. And you need to really think about this. They would call you a conspiracy theorist and they would take away your medical license. So people are not talking about it as much. They're afraid to talk about it. You have to think about this. Why do they not want this talked about anymore? Because we are at max levels and the signal is everywhere and affecting everyone. If you go back between, 1980 and 1999, this is talked about all the time. You can find paper after paper. Now, you can find work on it, but it is very buried, and people are not so quick to post this as their own because they understand what the ramifications are. On the 25th of October in 1997, in New Scientist, they released this article saying the brain had its own FM receiver in it. You will not see articles like this anymore. And that is because it's in use. That's it for now. Look out for Charlie.
I don't like the world now. I mean, before I always knew I was a son of a bitch. But now I'm the only son of a bitch I know. I make way for a real human being. Get out of the way, yeah.
Look out for Charlie.
I want that son of a bitch dead. I want him dead.